Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. Now, all around the world, organizations are investing in millions and in some cases billions in new ways of working to tackle their most persistent, enduring, and complex problems, all in the service of achieving greater organizational performance. But one person, Steve Hearsum, is on a mission to challenge the status quo. Why do we spend so much on consultancies, business schools, and thought leaders to provide quick fixes for difficult problems? Steve is the author of the book No Silver Bullet. He's an experienced developer of change practitioners and consultants. He's a qualified consulting and coaching supervisor and works basically with change agents to create supervisory spaces to help them work through their most difficult challenges. Steve also practices as a consultant and he supports individuals, teams, and organizations to increase their capacity for collaboration and experimentation. And he has a huge breadth of experience working with clients from lots of different sectors, from global motor manufacturers to digital services and telecoms to the NHS and FMCG companies as well. He's also been heavily involved at Roffey Park, a trustee and council member for the Tavistock, and also previously served as co-chair of the Organisation Development Network for Europe. He's also got a connection to a lot of the guests that we've had on. I think, but Steve, it's 6 steps from Steve Hearsum is the way, isn't it?
That sounds really incestuous, doesn't it?
But he's added a new title to his list of accomplishments, and that's author. So his new book, No Silver Bullet, Moving Beyond Quick Fix Solutions in Business and the Psychology of Change Management, is due to be published on March the 29th. And we've been lucky to actually receive preview copies of the book to have a read of this in advance. So hide away your 2x2 grids and your iceberg models, because Steve is going to debunk many of these myths around this critical areas for organizations. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you. And just so you know, the wonders of Amazon mean that the title you read out is what appears on Amazon is slightly different to what you actually see on the book.
Okay.
Which is a bit confusing. So on the book it says No Silver Bullet, bursting the bubble of the organizational quick fix. The Amazon thing, the subtitles there tend to be a bit longer so that you can work the algorithm.
Aha.
Right, so we're going to kick off with just an easy question. So we've given a bit of a bio overview, but just tell us a bit about what you do, what your role does, what it involves. How do you describe what you do?
So the way I tend to describe what I do these days, and Garen, you did a lovely job of, I should hire you as my PR consultant. You did a lovely job of framing, in a sense, that the spaces that I work in. But if I was to nutshell it, the way I tend to think of what I do these days is probably 3 things. One is helping leaders develop their practice. And what I mean by that is with a focus on their how they sharpen the impact they have. My own view is that conventional leadership development is a waste of time and money. And there's actually plenty of evidence to support that, and it's in the book. The second thing I tend to do is work with both internal and external consultants and practitioners of many a hue, org design, org development, HR, change, to develop their consulting and practice skills so that they're more comfortable doing the work they do. And the third bucket that I tend to work with is and it's a big bucket, is culture. So it's anything to do with the behavioural mess that we have in organisations that goes under the label of culture, and they all link effectively. So I operate in those spaces, whether it be as a consultant, as a coach, or as a supervisor. That's kind of the spaces I play in.
Brilliant. And that's kind of supporting people at the centre of change, isn't it? So is that the node through which the crazy flows, as you describe it?
Yeah. It's I suppose the core interest is in building change capability in its broadest sense. Change capability with a small c on both words. What's it actually like to be in the middle of this stuff? Whether you are a practitioner or a consultant, whether you are indeed a leader, how on earth do you develop the capability and the capacity to be at the centre of change?
Brilliant. So we always ask this question because it's a really important story. Like, what was your journey into this field? How did you sort of find that this was an area for you to really focus your attention on and that people needed support in?
Well, I think there's a 2-part question there, Garen, in a sense. The first one is, I would be lying if I said I ever had a coordinated or strategic plan to get into this. If you know Baldric from Blackadder, it was a bit more like a turnip in the sense that my cunning plan was no more sophisticated than which doors opened in front of me that I was interested in what was on the other side. So literally, early in my career, the door that opened was one when I was at The Guardian, to have the opportunity to be part of a team of 9 internal people working with a group of external consultants, looking at the ways of working and the processes across The Guardian and Observer. And I was the only person to volunteer to go onto that. And the reason I volunteered was because I was fascinated by, well, why this person not talking to that person? And if they did talk to each other, wouldn't it be better? Or why is that bit not joined up with that bit? And this looks a bit mad. That looks a bit odd. And it was literally that. And from that point onwards, my career evolved. Over time, they told me. So there's a difference between being a consultant, that I did when I left the Guardian, and labeling myself as a change consultant and selling what I did or thought I did. And I think that the flip, it's actually a really interesting question that you asked me. What I'm just noticing is the difference is the moment when you start to listen to what it is that clients value in what you do and whether or not that's something you want to do more of. And I think in the last 6 to 8 years, possibly 10 years, I've got far more attuned to and are more aware of and go looking for what is it that clients value about what I do. And I tend to find that what I do that they value links to what I enjoy doing.
I was going to say that leads nicely onto my question, which bits of all of that stuff that you do you enjoy most?
That's probably really easy to answer. I had an email from somebody I work with. I've just finished a 9-month program with a group of internal, they're a mix of kind of HR, talent and change people within a very large services company. And I had this lovely email from one of the participants, Jake. He doesn't mind me using his name because I checked with him. And he just sent me this lovely email describing how, words to the effect of, he hadn't expected what he experienced, that we really did stretch them and stretched him, and he enjoyed that. And it's left him in a place now where he's far more aware of his practice and who he is in his practice. And these are my words, not his. I'm kind of summarizing it. But those are the things that I really, I suppose, I get a kick from. It's the people I'm working with. I have a sense of them going back into their organizations, and stuff's probably going to be happening around them that wasn't before, and they are probably in a more resourced place to deal with it. Not a finished article, because none of us ever are, but you just have this sense of them going, right, they're kind of rolling their sleeves up and going, that crap that I was dealing with before, nah, let's try something different.
Yeah, I really like the use of the word resourced, isn't it? Because you can give people insight and guidance and what so, but you can never predict what they're going to face. But obviously, they've got to sort of see themselves as a key part of that. And what's the kind of sort of the roughy part? So, is it self as instrument, isn't it?
Well, that's the me and Chung Judge thing. But the question I ask internals, I invariably say to an internal at some point when I work with them is, there's 2 questions you've got to answer, and they are in direct opposition often. One is, what does it take to get on in this organization? And 2, how do I need to be and what do I need to do to be of service? And it's surprising how often they are in opposition. Because if you are going to do the second one, that might mean saying to your CEO or the director of something, can I offer you an observation about how you're showing up? That might be a career limiting move, but it might be what the organization needs. And that links to the whole kind of self as instrument bit, which is, if you are really going to be doing that, then that might mean you stand out in a way that is of service, but is not necessarily comfortable for those around you.
And so you've gone through this process of writing this book, and it's taken you've obviously taken some time to sort of really develop the ideas, and it's something you felt for a long time. What really inspired you to put sort of pen to paper and to go, right, I'm going to try and articulate what I'm thinking, and I want to sort of provoke a conversation?
I suppose there's 3 things, Garen. So firstly was, I've always known that whilst I was kind of wondering if I could write one, I knew it would have to be something that got under my skin enough that I had the energy to do it, because I'm not very good at doing repetitive things. I like new stuff. So it had to be something that motivated me. The second thing that hooked me was, and it's in the book, it's the moment where for the first or second time, I hosted the Corporate Rebels at Roffey Park, and they said to the group of very experienced OD consultants and coaches, we started our journey 2 years ago, expecting to travel the world and find the magic bullet. And they said magic bullet, not silver bullet. And that was obvious to me. That didn't surprise me. What surprised me was that the room, several times after that, kind of went, yeah, but there is an answer, isn't there? And that was what hooked me. How is it experienced consultants and coaches who, like the 3 of us, we imagine that we are very self-aware and know there is no answer, are still telling people who've just told them there is no answer, have you got the answer? So that hooked me. And the third bit, which really gelled when I spoke to Graham Curtis, who's at Roffey Park now, his PhD, where he talks about this idea of functional collusion and unconscious patterns of behavior driven by shame and anxiety that influence decision making. That conversation fueled the inquiry, because I started to go to myself, I think there's something here. It's the only thing that makes sense of what I'm observing, but I have got no idea whether this hangs together. So for 3.5 of the 4 to 4.5 years I wrote the book, until last summer, and I spoke to the guy who chapter 10 revolves around, I actually was still questioning fundamentally whether my hypothesis was right.
I like to use the word hypothesis because I think sometimes that's the way we need to hold our ideas, isn't it?
Totally.
And to prove it, but we missed that point. For people that are joining this call, obviously they'll have an awareness of silver bullets, but it's good to define them as well.
Yeah.
We've all worked in the organization where it's the next big thing, and it could be TQM, it could be agile, it could be name any list in that as well. What is the concept of silver bullets in your mind, and what might be some of the silver bullets that people might be resting in their organizations right now?
In mythological terms, there's always been this idea that we can slay monsters, mythical monsters, with silver. I mean, that's been in human folklore for a long time. In organizational terms, it's this idea of the myth of fixability, which is something that Mark Cole and John Higgins originally coined as a term, which I love as a term. It's really, really useful. But we see this actually at a very simplistic level in the language you use. So if you listen to organizations and indeed to practitioners and consultants talking about landing the change or driving the change, they turn change into an abstraction because it makes it easier to imagine there's one thing we can do to move this monolithic object from one room to the other. So for me, it's anything that is sold with the certainty that it will fix things. If you buy this, if you use this, if you hire us, yes, this is the solution and it will work. And if you look at the way that business schools and consultancies tend to present themselves, very rare do you hear them say, well, it might work. Should we try?
That doesn't look so nice on the PowerPoint.
Well,
though,
but it doesn't. But actually, it is the far more honest answer, particularly with anything to do with human behaviour. To say you've got the culture intervention that's guaranteed to work, to my mind, is a total absurdity. Now, how can you possibly know?
And it's not the fault of consultants necessarily or the clients. It's kind of both, isn't it? So why are we so drawn to these ideas and silver bullets?
Why are we drawn to them? Because what gets missed is the excuse creaking chair, which won't sound good on a podcast. It's the fact that we often, as practitioners and consultants, are not that comfortable acknowledging our own fragility. You know, how okay are you when a client says to you, "So, Danny, can you help me with this?" Are you okay with sitting there and going, "If I'm really honest with myself, I don't think I can. I actually don't know that area, or I haven't worked in it, or I don't think, there's something about you as a client, as an organization that freaks me out and worries me." So how okay are you saying no, this is not for me? So we collude with that.
Yeah,
we are part of that as well.
It's a tension we manage constantly, I think.
Yeah.
When we're working with clients. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So reading your book, it's obviously you've done, you said it took 3.5, 4 years to write, and it's clear you've done lots of research and interviews and conversations. So was that a deliberate choice to really make it an inquiry as you went?
There's two answers to that. One is a yes, one is a no. The yes is absolutely at a certain point. I decided, well, actually from early on, I wanted to turn it into open. I used the language of open inquiry. So I posted all the chapters on a Google Sites website and just would make it available. And some people, I had more the people who said they would look at it. I had a subset of people who had the kindness and generosity to actually genuinely read some of the early chapters and tell me what they thought. The webinars I ran were all part of this idea of I want to test out the ideas and the whole concept of this thing and see how it lands. And my choice of people to do it with, people like Naomi Stanford, Simon Kavickia, Mark Cole, Dr. Wendy Shepherd from Cranfield, all of these people had different angles on the territory that I was exploring. So that was very much the open inquiry. But I also want to be really open about the fact that part of the reason it took 4.5 years is I had care and responsibilities. My life, life got in the way. And there was about 1.5 to 2 years where I barely wrote a word, even though it was going through my head. So I'm saying that because I don't want to collude with the idea that this was 4.5 years of joyous and continuous and incredibly professional inquiry where everything went smoothly, because that would be a total lie.
Yeah, but it's not the kind of idea that you just knock out, because it is you're constantly reflecting on your own practice. You're speaking to others, aren't you, in conversation?
Yeah, and it's also because, and you've read the thing, I'd be interested in whether you had this sense. My experience is every time I reread some of the chapters, I had to really carefully think about the wording of the language. What I didn't want to do was I wanted to challenge, say, take large consultancy. I wanted to challenge them really quite strongly, but I didn't want to be overly snarky. And so all the time I was trying to testing out my thinking. Does this make sense? Does it hang together? Does the kind of tapestry I'm weaving across 12 chapters or 12 sections, as it turned out, does this actually hang together as a narrative? And again, like I say, I didn't know whether it did until chapter 10.
Yeah, and I guess sort of inputs from people like Naomi Stammer, because I saw a webinar that you did with her, and she was sort of sharing her experiences. And even when someone is sort of seen as very, very accomplished in their field, they're kind of projected into the role of guru, aren't they? And there were times when I think she was giving an example where she did sort of 3 different organizations designs for a client, and they just wanted to be told, well, which one do you think is the right one? And she refused to say. Is that situation that you do see quite common in the research that you did?
It doesn't happen with me so much, because I think the way I show up these days, Garen, tends to probably make it clear there's not much point having that conversation with me. So I think I probably am repelling those kinds of clients quite early on, is my fantasy. Do I hear stories about that? Yeah, loads. In fact, I was talking to somebody recently, only the other day, who told me exactly the same thing. Of doing. In fact, no, it was somebody online. It was somebody who you probably know. So Nims, who has worked into recently in the civil service, talking about how a client saying no, I don't want that. That doesn't work for me. And then 12 months later, inviting her back in, because she was not offering her the certainty, but eventually realizes that maybe that's not what's going on.
And one of the things you talk about in the book is that the kind of whole social media stuff. You talk about Simon Sinek and kind of people being drawn to those kind of sound bites. Do you think the attraction to silver bullets is getting greater, and people are more drawn to the simplification? I was talking to Garen earlier. Simon Sinek, Stephen Bartlett's another one. Kind of those kind of really short, pithy quotes.
Well, yeah, because there's all this has to be seen in the context of what goes on in society, outside of our bubble of being organizational consultants, which is we live in a world where nuance and ambivalence are eschewed in favour of binary and or thinking, where unless you're taking a firm position on something, you're not being decisive enough. So we're expected to be for and against things. Very difficult to say, well, actually, I'm really not sure about that. Can't you make your mind up, Steve? Well, no, actually, I want to think about it a little bit more deeply, which is why when you get politicians like, Rory Stewart, who I think is a really interesting politician and human being, who's talking about, and I'm reading his autobiography at the moment, talking about politics and talking about his ambivalence towards some of it in there. He's a total outlier. To have somebody like him talking about the fact that many of his colleagues there's lots of shame in the political system of government. That isn't talked about much.
Times are weird when Rory Stewart is seen as a radical, don't you?
Yeah. So in that context, when you're saying, so are we, everything works against us being able to hold a nuanced position. If you look at the way, let's take just one example, 2 examples actually. So with thought leaders, thought leadership emerged pretty much from sort of the business school and consulting world. Business schools sell their programs and sell executive education on the certainty that you will become a great leader and a better leader. You'll become a more effective chief executive or whatever. Consultancies sell pretty much on 2 modes of consulting. So if you look at their literature, they sell on expert and they sell on pair of hands. We're going to deploy hundreds of consultants and we will do things for you. They don't tend to sell on the basis of the collaborative consulting. I mean, it's in there, but it's not really what they do. If you talk to people who worked on the inside, particularly people who've left, often for ethical reasons, they leave because they're sick and tired of being discouraged from doing anything that works towards capability building. So everything outside societally orientates towards us taking fixed positions. So thought leadership and big names, we like celebrity as well. So it needs to be easily digestible, charismatic, simple and profound and inspiring. But the easily digestible bit is not the same thing as consuming something where you need to really chew on it and establish what kind of flavour it is. I mean, there's a metaphor there with food. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I'm sure there is one. But actually being invited to think a bit more deeply is not something that's that common. There's a bit in the book about bullshit receptivity. And I think, if I remember correctly, what it talks about is that people who are incredibly good at intuiting and processing information quickly, part of the problem with that sometimes is they have got less of a filter for bullshit because they will just suck it up.
And there's so much going on the client side, isn't there? Like, what's kind of driving this? And I guess one of the things that sort of we're taking away from this, and Danny, you definitely picked up on this, isn't it? Is sort of the lack of time that people put into things, and just the constant feeling of need of speed and action, and that as well.
Yeah, but I smell a rat because smell a rat for two. Okay, yes, in many organisations there's less resource, there's less money, there's lots of pressure on, there's more work to do with less resources, and time is one of the things that goes. So yes, I accept that. But if what you're facing is a challenge which genuinely requires you, even for a moment, to slow down and go, hang on a minute, are we running at 100 miles an hour in the right direction? There is no challenge that you face that does not, particularly complex ones, that does not merit you stopping for a second. And I'll give you a really good example. Think about what happens when somebody crashes with potentially some kind of medical condition in A&E. You need medical people who, at some level, have got a moment of tapping either into their tacit knowledge or into their experience to go, what's the choice I need to make here? They've got no time, so I don't buy it.
So what's that about then? Do you think it's if people keep moving fast, then nobody questions them? Or
if we move fast, we don't have to think, we don't have to feel, and it's probably the latter that actually is the first one. And when I think about the clients I'm working with at the moment and some I've worked with recently, what I notice is the faster they move, the less they have to think about how they're relating with each other, the conversations they're avoiding having with each other, how the conflicts that they have had, but they really don't want to go any further. And I'll give you a perfect example. I was working earlier this year with a wonderful group of people overseas in the Middle East, very senior leadership team. And in that cultural context, they moved and worked together very much as one, very fast. But I had this lovely conversation with one of them who was one of the more introverted, reflective group members. And the conversation I had with them was, your colleagues are brilliant, but the value you bring, the difference you bring is that you actually ask questions and you slow them down. And they need you to speak up occasionally and just ask them whether they're running 100 miles an hour over the cliff. Is that a good idea? And on the third day, it was really interesting to see him suddenly becoming more visible and these questions being dropped in and the rest of the group just going, wait a minute.
So do you sort of see it as a way of suppressing their anxiety levels?
Totally. Yeah, and I recognise that I know, my counter-transparency with this. I know that intellectually, and sort of my own, I used to use my intellect and my own grandiosity as a defence to keep others at bay and keep my anxiety at bay. Well, absolutely, I'd say this partly because I'm deeply familiar with that internal psychological process.
Yeah, and obviously we're familiar with the extensive work that you've done at sort of senior leader level, and obviously we're just really interested to hear about your practice as a practitioner. When you're in the room and you are starting to encourage the team to sort of pay attention to how they're feeling and maybe asking some of those provocative questions, how receptive are they to it? How easy do they find to start working on that, or can it be sort of a challenge?
It can be, and there's you expect me to say, Garen, that there's no right answer. I mean, what comes to mind is an experience I've had very recently with a group of leaders where myself and my colleague have been scaffolding some interventions to get them to the point where they're actually going to be able to start to have the conversations that they know they need to have, but they've been worried about having and been too scared to. And there was this moment, and it couldn't have been clearer. We've done the work of saying, what do you need to talk about, or what do you need to focus on? Well, we need to talk about these things. We need to be more candid with each other. Okay, we need help to do it. Well, we'll scaffold all these things. This is how you need to do it. This is how you can do it. Here's the space to do it. Just bringing them together. Right. Now move towards each other and have a conversation. And what you literally had in the moment was some of the people in the room going, real intake of breath, this sense of, I'm a bit scared, I'm a bit nervous, but sod it, I'm going to go and do it anyway. But there was this other feeling in the room which felt a bit like, and came across to me, my interpretation was, no, I don't think I want to do that. I've been led this far, and my fantasy is they would much rather be given another model that will tell them how to do it, but they won't necessarily then go and do it anyway. because we there's not much more we can do to get them into a space to have the conversation now. We're now bordering on the stage of the intervention, which is we're noticing that we've created the conditions, but you don't want to move into this space, and it's the anxiety that stops them.
Yeah, and I guess, do you need to take the whole team with you to have those in conversations, or can you sort of build out from just a few?
It's the myth that everybody has to be with you. I mean, the other one of my core assumptions is in any group of n number of people, I will guarantee you that not everybody is going to get what they need. It's impossible. I'm a bit wary of groups where every person says this is brilliant. Just don't buy it. It's what are you not telling me? Somebody's got to be at least a bit disappointed or not like my style, because I know I'm Garen. I know I'm Marmite. I'm really clear about that. So I expect people to like me or like what I do, but I also expect someone to go, oh no, I'd rather not have him. Which is why I choose to work with people often who are very different stylistically to me.
Yeah, but again, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because we talk about the role of consultant participating in this as well, and there's a lot of ego involved there, isn't it? Like, in a way, it can be very tempting for the consultant to want to hear, you all think I'm amazing, you all think I've given you a cathartic moment. Well, that's a good job done, isn't it?
I had the lovely Jake in his email, and when I was working with the group last week, they all said to me, and we now say sometimes, what would Steve say? And he said in his email, I've got Steve on my shoulder or something, and that they were kind of very clear about saying, they're saying it's like we're using you as a metaphor for something. But another part of me is going, oh, that's a nice stroke. The ego in me is kind of going, oh, I love that. I'm not ashamed to say that. Of course, part of me loves that. But equally, I really don't want to be on a pedestal where they think that everything I think, say, or do or feel is right, because that is putting me into the guru place, the thought leadership place.
And it touches on another thing as well, isn't it? Which is, although it's not, when you're on someone's shoulder, you're not getting paid to be on someone's shoulder, but it's that dependency, isn't it, that can be developed on consultancy too. And obviously, with OD, the idea is temporary scaffolding and then out, because it's not doing them any service.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I've talked to you about this before, Garen. I have a slightly ambivalent relationship with the field at the moment. And I'm in conversations with people with an ODNE at the moment about my ambivalence, and what am I representing as part of the field, in my ambivalence. But if OD as a field is really interested primarily in building the scaffolding, then why are we so attached to the label of OD, for example? If it's really about the scaffolding and being of service to the system, isn't the label irrelevant? And therefore I get very suspicious when I see or I feel that there's a real clinging to the label, and particularly when it's used as an othering mechanism. Oh, we're OD, you're HR, which I've seen before. That's why I get a little bit suspicious.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when you look at the people we've had on this podcast, when you talk about what is organisation development to you, everybody's got a different story. So many people don't even have OD in their title. No. I think we've got somebody coming up who doesn't even really describe himself, didn't really understand what OD was at all, but he's definitely working in ways that we would associate with it.
There's a guy based up in Scotland called Phil Lewis who runs something called the Change Punks. So you should drop Phil a line. He's a really interesting guy. Look at his website. It's so wonderfully analog, deliberately so. But you talk to him about his practice, OD, you might as well be talking to him in Cantonese or something. He's utterly alien to him. But his practice, his change practice, is really interesting. Really interesting.
We'll put him on the list.
Yes, just for the name.
Yeah.
I guess one thing I also want to understand as well is we've all seen the scar tissue of silver bullets in organizations. What are some of the things, and we talked about suppression of anxiety and that, but what do you see as some of the consequences that concern you most about silver bullets in organizations?
Oh God, I'm going to try and make this a relatively short answer, Garen, because there's a whole number. So let's just pick some of the implications. So let's start at the top. At the top, what it means is you have senior leadership teams that are, at worst case, spending a lot of money on stuff where they didn't really need to. Example, major UK bank refusing to spend anything less than £10,000 on an external consultant because they don't believe, £10,000 per day, because they don't believe that anybody who charges less than that is worth the time and money. So I know somebody who normally would be charged out at £2,000 a day, saying, well, if that's what they want to pay, it's the only way I'll go to do work with them. So there you go. There's one. Money is just shanked, or as in Boris Johnson speaks, spaffed up against the wall. Okay. So that's the money thing. There's the human cost, which is you've got senior leadership teams who are far more anxious and going through an absolute mincer because they're deluding themselves and being deluded by others that there are answers, there are silver bullet answers, and therefore they're in this cycle where they keep on buying these things but they don't work, and therefore it becomes even more anxiety inducing. The next layer damage is to people in organizations. Let's pick one example. If I think back earlier in my career, so new technology, I remember vividly BCG coming into the organization I was working in at the time when they were starting to move classified advertising in magazines to online self-service. So silver bullet, online self-serve classified advertising. You don't need that headcount, so we'll get rid of these people. And I can still remember to this day walking into the offices in somewhere up north of London, and somebody saying to me as you walked in, going, "Yeah, they're having to rehire loads of those people again." So there's literally, as with bullets, there's collateral damage. People lose their job, people lose their livelihood, and you could argue at a societal level, and it's laid out very clearly in the Big Con, the book that came out last year. It's well worth a read. We have the way in which large consultancies have people who move between government to large professional services firms and back again, and the way in which government policy is being set and influenced heavily by a whole value system that arguably is about maintaining a particular industry and sector, i.e. consulting, rather than it being about public good. So there's multiple layers to this. Okay.
Yeah, and I guess you got the sort of the law of unintended consequences, because they all do a thing, don't they, that we don't quite expect.
Totally, and yeah, and I suppose that but you're then right into the heart of it, which is how often do we offer to a client something and say, we think this is what it will do, but there may be some other things that happen that we don't know. I'll give you a really good example. I'm right in the middle. I'm just in the middle of doing a culture review for an organisation, and we've said to the client, we will hold the mirror up to you, and there will be most of this stuff you're going to know already. There may be some stuff that's going to come up that is going to be new to you. Now, the reality is, however we present that stuff back, there's a possibility that some people really will not like it. There's a possibility there could be some unintended consequences, but I don't see there's any way out of that if you are going to be totally honest with the client about what's really going on in their organisation.
So one of the secrets then is courage in contracting with the client and actually getting their sort of informed consent.
Well, yeah, but even there, it still may not work. So if there's this lovely idea in transactional analysis around it's called contracting around protection, permission, and power. So protection sets the territory in which you're doing the work. It's the time frame, the ways you're going to work, whatever, all that stuff. The permission is, I actually am going to give you permission to do this thing. And Helen Charles Edwards, who I do quite a bit of work with, who's qualified in organizational TA, she tells this lovely story of contracting robustly with a client around permission and protection and stuff, and thought she had it. And then when the crap hit the fan, she found that there wasn't the protection there. Nobody had her back. The client was running over the hills as far as his little legs could take him. So even with robust contracting, you only really find out what that's worth when it's tested.
Yeah,
that's the only way.
Yeah, and it's one of the things you talk about in the book, isn't it, that the reason organizations and senior leaders aren't want to bring in consultants is because they're trying to outsource that kind of anxiety and have somebody to blame when things go wrong. It's kind of a defense mechanism to have somebody else to go, it wasn't us, we brought in the best of the best.
Yeah.
And look
which is why some organizations will only hire in Big Four or Big Six. I'm far more of a risk because I'm not a big name.
Yes, absolutely. So that's what I thought was interesting in your book, was you talk about the kind of mythologizing of theories and theorists and kind of the way that we simplify kind of people.
Oh yes, the
field.
The regurgitation of three-step change models. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Are you worried that's going to happen to your book? People are going to simplify.
Look, if you ever see anybody describe me as a thought leader, you're at liberty to email me and tell me where it is, and I'll quickly run over or do something using it.
I was just commenting on it. Really, I think it's really prevalent, isn't it? And again, it's that draw. We want to make the world as simple as possible. So simplifying somebody's complex research is
yeah. But that's why I think something like ProSci is such a sweet example of that. Because at face value, ADCAR has got some utility. It's a really lovely model of personal change in the process we go through. But as I say in the book, to sit through 3 days of a certification of several hundred slides, and to be, to get into a conversation with a very good consultant who's running it and doing the training, and me pointing out that there's nothing in here about conversation and dialogue and stuff. And he went, yes, you're right, 70% of this is dependent on dialogue, but it's nowhere in the freaking materials. And the thing that just leapt out was the moment when there were 2 people from the same organization in the room, and their organization had sent multiple people on ProSci trainings. And she said, I didn't realize how many people actually done this course until I said in the office the other day, I'm going on the ProSci certification. And then all these people stuck their hands up and said, oh yeah, we are too. And so this organization was sending people on this program as if that in itself was the answer.
What, trying to achieve some kind of tipping point of once enough people have done it, then...
No, I think it was as simple as, if we send them on ProSci, that will be, once we've got enough people trained in this methodology, then everything will be fine. And
that's the silver bullet, isn't it?
That was the silver bullet. I spoke to somebody else who was very senior in HE not long afterwards, who described a very similar thing. He said, yeah, our organization is looking at ProSci, and it absolutely was being framed as, we'll wheel this in and then change will be fine.
It's soothing anxiety. It's, it's the, and the conversations and the dialogue is the stuff that's really hard to build capability in and for people to lean into for all the reasons we've talked around anxiety and shame and the things it triggers for people.
I mean, a lovely example of this, which is not a methodology, but one of the things I observed about behavioural frameworks is, and I was working with a client over the last year, supervising some really lovely people in the NHS, and this organisation has got a new behavioural framework, but it's an abstraction. And whenever you talk to people in the organisation about what it will take to turn that into genuine behaviour change, they get really scared, because what I say to them is, you do realise that the only way you're going to get behaviour change is if, when you take your behavioural framework and you say, so Danny, in that last meeting, I actually experienced you in a way where you weren't really respecting my contribution. If we've got this value in the framework about respect, can we talk about this? Scares them rigid.
Yeah.
Right? That to me is a perfect example of how we turn ideas into methodologies or constructs and abstractions to manage the anxiety, and then we were able to just move them to one side. We don't really have to engage with the reality of the conversations that are right to be had. So just to finish that, one of the things I say about my work is every single thing I do is all about scaffolding a conversation and an inquiry. The only question is, what's the conversation, what's the inquiry?
Yeah, and it's a really powerful point you're making. And I guess, like, when you do actually see the authoring of things like behavioural frameworks, there's lots of multiple agendas at play in the design of the framework, isn't there? So they may be wanting a particular behaviour to be complied to, or so it's often it's the formulation that really matters, isn't it?
Well, yeah. Have you read any of the stuff out of the Tavistock, the kind of social defences against anxiety stuff?
No, but I can feel our reading list is growing, which I'm enjoying this.
Yeah. So when you posted a while ago, Garen, I remember you did a really lovely post about transference, countertransference, projection, and you were highlighting these as really important facets of practice and stuff, and that was brilliant. I really like that. And the kind of the Elliot Jake stuff about social defences against anxiety is this lovely idea from the Tavistock tradition that the only reason we have things like job descriptions, business plans, strategy documents, memos, all these things are containers for anxiety. That's the only reason they exist. And I suppose the evidence for that, the simple evidence for that is we've probably all been in organisations where when the anxiety's gone up, they've got more command and control, and there's more process, and there's more documentation. They're all containers for anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. You see it in the HR field all the time. An incident will have a policy to, prevent that from ever happening again. Well, that's not going to be the thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm having so many flashbacks. I might need to book myself in for a supervision session after this, Steve.
That's all right. But it's I'd be delighted to. Yeah. But joking aside, it's not that I'm saying that we all need to become therapists. And there's a lovely guy who I've never met face to face, but I know him through LinkedIn, Ian Reid. He's based over in, I think, Switzerland, who is get very grumpy about the blurred boundaries between coaching and consulting and therapeutic practice. We are not therapists. We do not have the training. You know, and any coach, for example, who says they do trauma work, well, no, unless they've gone and done the years to do, to do the proper therapeutic training to do that work, then they're actually profoundly unethical in my view. But the reality is that most of what we're dealing with in organisations is that some, for what we're called into as OD people, what we call ourselves, is going to have some anxiety flying around. Why else are they calling the three of us? I mean, if your clients don't call you both because everything's going brilliantly, do they?
No.
And they're not worried about anything. It'd be brilliant, Garen, Danny, come in, because we want to tell you how brilliant it is. Bye.
It's easy to point the finger at things like senior leaders, but they're under a lot of pressure from boards, aren't they? Like the boards are putting enormous pressure. They want to see some kind of action, don't they?
Well, yeah, but the kicker is we're also culpable because we expect so much of them. We've, I mean, I just wish that we could finally take heroic leadership out and shoot it. Yeah. It needs to be laid to rest. But you can see heroic leadership is the zombie idea that will never die.
Yeah, it's the Alex Haslam paper, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's the role model that people see. That's, people have that in their heads because it's so prevalent, that role model of that's what a leader should be like. And then it's very hard to adopt a different style of leading or approach to leading when you've got that and that's expected.
Well, also it means we, that nested in, lurking in that is also what's our own personal willingness to follow. Now, am I really okay with following these people? It's why my observation about HE organisations is they're full of incredibly bright people who are really difficult to lead because they're incredibly bright, and the greater the propensity or the count of PhDs in the organisation, the more likely it is they think they know how you should be doing your job. But at some point, they also need to follow. And how do you manage that tension?
Yeah, and I guess even the professional services firms, which we're talking about a lot, is similar. Like the managing partner, how it is leading highly autonomous people and trying to get them working in a different way.
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, if you talk to some of the ex-consultants I work with, and there's a quote from one who I worked with a few years ago, and we've stayed in touch. And their description of working in one of the big four is, it was utterly psychologically damaging. This phrase, which several people have now told me since I first heard it, that they intentionally look for insecure overachievers. So the anxiety and the fragility is baked into the system from the moment they start recruiting bright young things out of uni. They're looking for the people who are driven by anxiety.
So we've kind of looked at it from both sides, the challenges of the consultants being called in to fix these complex, persistent, enduring problems, and we've looked at the anxieties and the pressures upon the people actually commissioning the work as well. And I think obviously one of the things that we're sort of identifying here from what you're saying is the importance of getting comfortable with not knowing.
Totally.
How can we create places, containers, whatever it is, that's going to encourage that on both sides? Like what might be some of the things that can help with that?
Well, if we had the answer to that, Garen, we probably would make a fortune.
Is this the sequel?
But it's funny you say that. I mean, I've been, some of the articles I've been asked, or pieces I've been asked to write for press in the last couple of weeks, I've had a very strong, consistent thread through them of I've been asked to write stuff. I was asked to do one, I think, for one of the CEO magazines around not precisely that, not knowing. How can you get more comfortable with not knowing? The only kind of suggestions I've got are very tentative, but they do tend to orientate towards you kind of have to do your own self-work. You've got to do your own reflexive rather than reflective practice. But there's a gnarly kind of truth, I think, in this, at least it's my truth anyway, which is if you are really going to inquire into not going, you are going into an existential place. If you're really going to go into not knowing, then you're actually going to have to open yourself up to the possibility that, for example, the world around the organisations that we work in at the moment is, quite frankly, utterly terrifying. It certainly is for me. It's so. How can I possibly, not knowing what will happen, for example, with Ukraine, and whether or not something will happen there with, low-level or high-yield nuclear weapons is utterly terrifying. But in organisations, they have their own different aspects of not knowing. I don't know what will happen if I bring this consultant in. I don't know what will happen if I bring this intervention in. Okay, that is an existential question.
And you mentioned the word reflexivity as well. So could you just give us a little bit of a definition about what that is and how it differs to reflective practice?
The simple way I describe it, there's a more complex definition, which is in a book on my shelf, which I might be able to find if you wanted me to. But for me, the way I tend to think of it is if critical reflection is you thinking about the influences on you, you're reflecting your feelings, your reactions, your responses, who you are, yourself, and all that. The difference that makes a difference is that with reflexivity, you don't just do that work in yourself. You also then move into cycles of inquiry about noticing how you then experience yourself and what you experience when you go into work, and then you bring those experiences back into a cycle of inquiry in yourself, and then you go back out. So there's this process of looking at yourself both in and out of your practice context. And if your practice is as a consultant, then it's as a consultant. If your practice is as a leader, then it's in your leadership context. But it's that to me is why I'm a bit suspicious of when I experience practitioners talking about how deeply critically reflective they are, unless I have a sense that they really are prepared to work on their own shit, and they're also prepared to then really look at how that then shows up in their client work, then I'm thinking, no, you're not doing the work. Because if we go back to self as instrument, that's actually what that requires.
And that's the gritty work, isn't it? I think that's sometimes the thing that people underestimate when they go into to a field like that, isn't it?
Yeah. So I want to be really clear. So that if it sounds like I'm not being compassionate, it's not that I expect everybody, because I'm not a finished article. I'm not saying that everybody needs to either A, want to do that work, or B, needs to be at the same level. It's not about that. You can be a really inexperienced, in inverted commas, practitioner or leader or consultant, but my God, the admiration, I can think of somebody at the moment. There's one person I'm working with who, in their background, is professionally really competent and very skilled in their field, but has got a real fragility to them in other aspects. But they are throwing themselves into an inquiry, and they're relatively early in that inquiry in terms of who they are and how that part shows up in work. But the courage they're displaying, awesome,
And that brings me to one quote that stuck out for me in the book. You talked about we need thought partners, not thought leaders. And I think that really resonated for me, because a lot of what we talked about is we need somebody to help us kind of work through that stuff. Not tell us what to do and tell us what to think, but to help us think differently and reflect.
Yeah. But then there's so many things that are set against that, because you probably need to have the humility and to merely entertain the prospect that you're going to get into a kind of thought partner relationship with somebody, is to be open to the possibility that this might be an equal relationship, and that they may disagree with you, but they may agree with you on things. It's not as simple as I'm contracting with you to give me the answer.
And then last question that we always ask everyone that comes on: what advice would you give to someone who's thinking about taking their first steps into this field? And again, we've talked about the role of people who might be working inside the organization, that might be sort of seeing a fad coming down the road and helping them to create a better process, or someone who's actually an external consultant that's really trying to get into that space and trying to work more on an equal footing with their clients. What advice would you give them?
Yeah. The thing that popped into my head, Garen, was I occasionally get people approach me on LinkedIn who want to find out about how they get into OD. Or I had a guy who's got an amazing background in the States. He's a very senior leader, sold his business, and is now thinking about different career and thinking about taking what he's learned in one space into another. And so he was asking about, organizational behavior and OD and stuff like that. And I've had people who are very early in their career. But the common thing that strikes me about lots of these people I've spoken to is the ones that really seem to me to then make decisions and choices that are, well, I'll say this. They go and talk to lots of people to get lots of different perspectives. So they'll go and talk to people who might be an OD. They'll go and talk to people in leadership roles. They'll follow their curiosity to talk to different kinds of people to then compare what they're hearing. And so, for example, if it's within the OD space, there was one person I spoke to, and I encouraged them, go and talk to Roffy, go and talk to Maven about the masters there, go and look at NTL. This is what I do. It's cheaper, it's this, it's different. Come and have a conversation with me. Don't be in mind. These are all the different kinds of things. There you can go and talk the iGold program and relational change. There's all these different types of programs in adjacent spaces. Go and talk to them and see what floats your boat. What are you repelled by and who are you drawn towards? And worry less about the the tribe or the guild that they associate with tune into, does this feel like the kind of work you want to do? And people who are open to that kind of conversation seem to make choices that are closer to meeting their needs at a human level, at a practice level, rather than I think I should be doing this qualification.
So what's next for you? Another book? Have you got the next book in your head?
I do actually. And I've got somebody who has said they will write it with me, but I'm going to call him on it, see whether he is. But yeah, there is another book. I'm happy to tell you what it is, because as you say, I like doing my stuff in the open. So I have another hypothesis, which is there is tons of stuff written about change capability, but what I don't think has been written is, or been thought through clearly enough, is when organizations say they want to build change capability, they tend to think of it in terms of either change leadership or change practice. What they don't tend to do is say, when we want to build and change capability, we want to talk to you about building change capability across the piece. That means board level through to whoever it is we want to facilitate and actually do it, and also how that lot joins together in the conversations they need to have, and the relationships they need to have, and the contracts they need to have. And I have heard, I think somebody told me about one organization where they did that, but I'm really unaware of organizations and leadership teams that do that. So the book I have in mind is how do you do a genuinely integrated and holistic process of change capability building that doesn't silo practice and silo leadership.
That is an important book, because it encourages everyone to take their share of their responsibility to make sure that it works as well.
Well, it's the thing I say in the book, Garen, about the number of times I've seen organisations spend a fortune on developing change practice and then immediately put those people into the pool for redundancy as they decide to restructure. I mean, there you go. I mean, it's totally absurd.
And on the subject of the absurd, we did have one question that we were going to introduce out of context, but
go on then.
Danny the panda. We're asking about the panda, don't we?
Yeah.
Yes, we just really enjoyed the story you shared in the book about the PA. I think it was the chief exec's PA, or big boss's PA, who had a panda on the desk. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Is the idea that the senior leader in the organisation, in their office, that if you were going to approach him about some blinding idea you had and you wanted to go in and talk to him, that what his PA would do would put a toy panda in a particular place in the office and have it facing a particular way, so you'd know whether or not it was safe to go in and talk to the big boss and share your idea. If the panda was facing the wrong way, best not to go in there. Really not a good idea. So yeah, in fact, it's the basis for a whole new field for panda-based OD, I think.
At every level, that story's wrong, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
But it's really interesting. It's really interesting as well, though, isn't it? The way people develop systems and in unexpected ways. Yeah.
But it's what brings to mind is it's just how innovative people are. They will develop workarounds that cut right against the grain of all organizational processes. And the last wee story I'll tell you is donkeys years ago. I used to work in doing consulting and magazine publishing, and you may remember there was a heavy metal magazine called Kerrang. Right, you're both nodding, so you're old enough to remember that. And I was told this story when I was doing requirements gathering for a new sales order processing system, that the way in which you got an ad into Kerrang was it would bypass the main sales ordering process, and there was a bloke called Brian or Eric at the end of a telephone line, and Brian would take your ad. If Danny, you wanted to recruit a new lead singer for your punk rock band, so in would go your advert, and Brian would take your credit card details, and if you're lucky, he'd actually process the payment at some point. But if he did, your name and details were outside the kind of the main system. So it was totally against all GP, all data protection regulations. But what they'd done was they had bypassed the really crappy, poorly functioning sales order processing system that they had, and it was just a wonderful piece of ingenuity. So it's the metaphorical equivalent of a panda.
And all of that ingenuity and innovation is laying dormant in our organizations, waiting to be unlocked, isn't it?
Yeah, it was brilliant. You're absolutely right, Garen. It was brilliant innovation. It was a response to something that wasn't working, and in the absence of the leadership of the organization or the organization as a whole responding to that, they found a way around it.
Brilliant. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you, Steve, for your time. We were looking forward to this conversation, weren't we, Danny? Because we knew we were going to get a really sort of, one of the things that we like to do is we get our own practice provoked and for us to challenge it as well. And we've had loads of that as well. So thank you. Obviously, wishing you all the best with the book. It's a really good read. As I said, we're going to have a copy of the book link in the show notes with this. It is a really good read, isn't it, Danny?
Absolutely. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think some of the things I'm taking away from today's conversation are obviously the heroic leadership's time has come, and the longer it exists, the more damaging it becomes. The importance of being comfortable with not knowing, and that's something to be celebrated in this age where we're asking for, decisiveness. It's not always the right thing. The importance of reflexive thinking, holding the mirror up, making sure that we're challenging the assumptions that we're operating under, the just critical importance of humility, and really shifting from thought leaders to thought partners, and that requires effort on both sides of the equation to make that work as well. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Your absolute pleasure.
If anyone wants to get hold of you, are you happy to field inquiries and questions from people?
Yeah. And even if they want to tell me how wrong I am, because then I still have this thing about, I'm